speech to its extreme limits, then you have to lose certain other freedoms that you are supposed to enjoy. In other words, one has to strike a balance between one right and the other right, one freedom and the other freedom. Immediately, I remember after the Rushdie affair, there was a television program on the CBS, and I was one of the guests with Professor Fawad Ajmi of Johns Hopkins University. Charlie Rose, one of the well-known anchors in PBS, was the host. And we were discussing this idea of Rushdie's satanic verses within the context of the freedom of speech that is valued so highly in the West. Fawad Ajmi insisted that what Salman Rushdie did was the exercise of the freedom of speech. I only made a remark, half jokingly at that time, but obviously neither Charlie Rose nor Fawad Ajmi was amazed. I said, look, it's true that Salman Rushdie has exercised his freedom of speech, but now, as a result of that, he cannot exercise the freedom of movement. It's funny. So, if you go to the extreme of exercising one freedom, you are sacrificing your other freedom. He's hiding somewhere, and he continued to hide almost for 4 or 5 years. So you lose freedom of movement. Ultimately, one has to balance how different freedoms have to be exercised. The history of blasphemy as a liberating force is specifically a European phenomenon. It's not even American. To understand the political role of blasphemy in Europe, we need to appreciate the organization of the church as an institutional power. Blasphemy in the European context was not merely a theological project. It was a political project used both by papacy and the Catholic Church and the emerging proto-nationalist European states. It is instructive to remind ourselves, therefore, that this distinctly European notion of blasphemy and resist, therefore, we should resist making the false comparison with our own faith and cultural traditions, whose histories, including the dialectic between secular and religious affair, have unfolded entirely differently and in distinct ways. Our religious leaders seem to have appropriated this distinctly and specific European notion of blasphemy and made it into a common Islamic theme in their anti-minority discourse. I remember reading Wittgenstein one time. He wrote in one of his writings that there are sometimes expressions in our language that must be withdrawn and sent to the laundry for cleaning, and then they can be put back for circulation again. I believe both the freedom of speech and blasphemy are the two concepts that need some immediate cleaning. Nevertheless, the European experience is not without a lesson for the rest of the Muslim world. It is precisely because of a history of opposition between the organized religion and political society and the consequent history of religious civil wars that comparisons have been worked out in Europe, and compromises have also been worked out in Europe, both to protect the practice of free speech and to circumscribe it through laws and criminalize blasphemy. When internalized as civility rather than imposed by the political power, these compromises have served as a key to keeping social peace in European societies. In Britain, for example, where there has been a blasphemy law on the book, which has never or rarely been put into action, and even in cases where publishers were confronted with such a dilemma, for example, whether to publish certain controversial literature, controversial in the sense anti-Christian, and even those publishers who had nothing to do with Christianity or they were not practicing Christians, nevertheless they had, for the most part, internalized legal restraints as civility, as conduct necessary to upholding peaceful existence in a society with a history of religious conflicts. To put it differently, the existence of political society requires the forging of a political pact, a compromise, a respect for the cultural and religious sensitivities of the others. In the United States, there has, over the decades, emerged an incredible level of protection for free speech. And despite the publishers and the media houses, they have exercised self-imposed restraint when needed, rather than being forced by the state through legal actions. The Supreme Court some time ago in the United States gave a landmark decision with respect to the freedom of speech and established a test, a litmus test, what they call the LAPS test, LAPS. And what it means is that the state will protect free speech only when a writing, an expression, a cartoon, or a painting meets this LAPS test. And the LAPS means that it must have literary, artistic, political, and scientific value. If any speech, any painting, any cartoon, any expression of art or freedom of speech does not stand for the redeeming values of literary and artistic and political and scientific significance, that speech should not and cannot be protected by the state. But going back to the social constraints and the role of politics in the United States, to prevent free speech from degenerating into hate speech and bigotry, one must look at the examples of the 1960s and the civil rights movement. At that time, there were television stations and radios and newspapers mocking implicitly and explicitly African Americans, making fun of them and ridiculing them and creating what's called the hate environment for them. Their claim, as is often made about Muslims today, is that African Americans needed to be more light-hearted, as we Muslims are told that you should have a sense of humor. A cartoon is a cartoon. You should be light-hearted and should learn to more able to laugh at yourself and to understand a humorous self-criticism. With the Watts Right in 1965, however, many of these programs quickly changed their contents or went off the air altogether. The Watts Right were important because they raised a question not too unfamiliar to the white Western world today when it comes to us Muslims. And the question that was raised at that time was, how could a small petty incident, an ordinary encounter between a white racist cop and a black motorist, could trigger such large violent riot that has left so many people dead? Many whites then asked, what is wrong with these people? How can the response be so disproportionate to the injury? And this was precisely the question raised by the